I made the most of it. We're going to talk about museum today. As I was listening to David, I had almost had an epiphanic moment about museums, because I think our two topics have a lot in common, right? It's about empowerment, about cross-racial cooperation. I was listening to what you said, and the Dark Nawa Museum is about cross-racial cooperation. This is in Morocco, by the way. I will be talking a lot about Morocco. You also said that South Africa Foundation South Africa was based on dispossession and injustice. That's pretty much the same story for heritage and the North-South relations, with European museums keeping a lot of artifacts and stolen goods from Africa. 95% of the African heritage is out of Africa, apparently, in public institutions in Europe and North America. So why talking about museum? Every time I give a conference, sometimes people roll their eyes like, ooh, museums. You don't have to like museums to be interested in museums. So let me make a small plea for museums before I start my talk. Convincing you not to leave the room right now. So the first reason museums are important is because they are symbolic places, right? You have empty museums in Africa. You have museums that have been emptied during colonizations. You have museums in Europe with curators that fear that their museum is going to get emptied because of the decolonization of heritage. So this is a very symbolic place. And you have also European curators saying, we don't need to restitute what we have because your objects are like ambassador objects. They represent your country here, so they might as well stay here. So that's one reason. It's very symbolic place. It's very easy to politicize and instrumentalize museums as well. We've seen it with my president, Macron, who 8 years ago promised that within 5 years he would restitute all the African heritage in France. He restituted 28 pieces in 8 years, so obviously he didn't deliver. So it's very easy to instrumentalize museums too. And the last thing I wanted to say is with regards to SDGs. If you look at the 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, you have 17 of them. 12 of them can be implemented and fulfilled by museums. So they are a real hub where you can do a lot of things. For instance, build sustainable communities, sustainable cities. That's one of the SDGs. You can also, it's also a hub for innovation and industrial innovation, artistic innovation, another of the SDGs. So museums matter, and that's why I'm going to talk today about one of them, the Dark Nawa Museum, which is one of the few AI-enabled museums in Africa. And sometime we were talking about it with David before. People don't like the word decolonization. They're afraid it's like too ideological or too politicized. So I'm gonna talk instead about empowerment. So let's have a look at this map. Could you, I'm gonna do the talking, but I have one question for you first. Could you guess what those numbers correspond to for each African country? It's okay not to know because that's what I thought, and it's not. It's probably very close. It's actually the number of data centers, AI data centers. So in South Africa, it's not easy to see. Sorry, the figures is a bit hidden. It's 56, 1/5 of them. In Morocco, the place I'll be talking about, 12. In Kenya, 19. In Egypt, 14. So that looks pretty impressive, and you have 233 of them in the whole of Africa, 236 of them in Japan, so that's just about as many as in Japan. But it's only about less than 2% of the world's total data centers. And that ring a bell with my studies in heritage studies, because as I just said, only 5% of Africa's cultural heritage is in Africa, and it's the same that's going on with data. And Professor Kim Soo-won had this idea back in December last year, telling me we should decolonize AI and museum. And I was, oh, this is a far shoot for my very narrow mind. But actually, that's what I'm going to try to do, and that's why we're doing this project now. There are many parallels where you can make the decolonization of AI, the decolonization of museum, and decolonization of ODA converge and converse. Research questions. To what extent do AI-driven data practices challenge or reproduce colonial patterns? So we're going to have a first part that is a bit theoretical. Where and how do the decolonizations and AI of AI and African heritage intersect. So I'm going to try to draw some parallels between those two processes. And then how to assess and remap the techno-cultural empowerment of African museums. And I'm going to come up with two assessing models, parameters, so that we can see from within the museum whether we have decolonized process through AI, and from a broader AI ecosystem as well, because once again, museums are not microcosms disconnected from reality. I want to show you how they interact with the broader AI ecosystem. So it matters to Korea because Korea, as a donor country, ODA country from the OECD, has a common history of being looted and colonized by Japan, partly, but not only. And also it matters to Korea because, as we were talking about it with Suwon and David before, Korea built a museum in Africa, and our project is about doing museum cooperation as well with Morocco and maybe South African museums too. And it's important for Korea's identity as a donor country because Japan is doing the same. It's helping build a museum in Zambia and in Egypt and in Togo. China is doing the same. It has built an AI museum in Ethiopia and a brand new museum in Senegal too. So how can Korea distinguish itself looking sideways from other Asian donor countries? That's an interesting question, I thought. And that's what I will be talking about in 2 weeks' time in Jeonju, just to give you a preview of the competition in Kinshasa between ODA project and museum project in Kinshasa. But that's the first part. So to me, as social scientist, AI is just software plus hardware plus infrastructure. Before starting the project, I must admit I didn't know much about AI. Okay, the functions of AI is just to collect data, right? To manage it, to inventory it, to classify it, to synthesize it, to analyze stuff, and then to be even able to predict some patterns, right? But data and AI are neither neutral nor objective because algorithms are still made by men, and so they have some biases, and you have a growing body of literature talking about how AI is biased. Even the very word AI, the very concept artificial intelligence, is not ideologically neutral because artificial is a belief that what is man-made can be better than nature. And intelligence, of course, has some very controversial history as a word because intelligence has a history of racial hierarchy, right? The beliefs in eugenics, that is common to eugenics as well. So AI is not a neutral word. So what I want to demonstrate and show is that beneath tech solutionism, you should be aware that there are digital colonialism, data colonialism. I want to focus on those two words, basically, on those two concepts. Digital colonialism is a belief that you have a lineage between what the Western companies were doing in Africa, extracting raw materials, and today's tech companies that are using not the same infrastructure, not transportation infrastructure, but telecommunication infrastructure to extract data. So there is that history, that lineage. Data colonialism, on the other side, has not such a strong north-south divide dichotomy in it because northern internet users' data may as well be exploited. So the north-south divide is less clear in data colonialism. Let's move on to the next slide. We here have empirical, I'm looking for empirical proofs, evidence that you have parallels between colonialism and nowadays like data colonialism. So on the left side, you have the world map in the 17th century with the trade flows, and we can see that on the right side, on the right map, you have undersea cables. We can see on both maps that Africa is well connected to the rest of the world, right? But if those maps were interactive or immersive, like AI maps, we would see that the flows are asymmetrical. And as I was saying, most of the data today is flowing out of Africa. And you can see it in two ways, in a very tangible way, because what we need for using AI in our mobile phones and in our computers are first very tangible minerals, cobalt, copper, you name it. There are many of them that we need that are coming from Africa mostly. And then on the right side, the map is the number of data centers in the world. So you have more than 4,000 in North America, 2,500 in Europe, and as I was saying, only 233 now in Africa. So I'm trying to draw parallels because I'm thinking if we had heritage colonialism with objects leaving Africa and being stored in museums, isn't it the same with data flowing out of Africa and being stored and managed by tech companies out of Africa? Drawing those parallels, I noticed that coloniality is in a way rebooted because you still have very pyramidal or hierarchical structures with northern tech companies on top and southern citizens at the bottom with the same kind of colonial patterns. And it's the same with museums because you have on top, I mean, it used to be the case, hopefully it's going to change, but Northern European museums that keep the best artifacts and that don't want to restitute them. And then during colonization, the best museums were national museums, or even in the French case, for instance, in the Western Africa, you had the best pieces were gathered in Dakar, which was the capital of AOF, Western Africa. And so today, Senegal is in a very uncomfortable situation where it has to restitute pieces that they didn't steal in the first place, right? So this is part of the story of the parallel between heritage and AI. I went a few years ago to, this picture, to the Africa Museum in Belgium, in Tervuren, a small town, which has more than 100,000 artifacts from Rwanda and Congo, DR Congo. And what you can read, there are 3 statues, and you can read at the bottom of the statue, what's the civilizing mission, it's all about then. Belgium is bringing well-being to Congo, Belgium is bringing security to Congo, and Belgium is bringing civilization to Congo, right? And you almost have the same kind of narrative with big tech companies now. They're bringing progress, development, they're doing good, they are connected the unconnected, and it all sounds like they're doing this out of altruism, out of empathy almost, right? So there is still that duplicity in the language, because on the one hand they pretend to do good, but on the other hand they take out either data or minerals so that they can do good, which is obviously contradictory, right? And then bingo, you notice that actually the data life cycle, this is made by Montoya and Roberts, so generating data, collecting it, storing it, analyzing it, etc., is actually the same with the objects that are in museums. They are first created by source communities, then they were collected during colonization. Collected, which is of course a euphemism, right, for most of the time looting or buying at a very cheap price, or bargaining or bullying people to give them the fetish, right? Then you have those epistemic analysis prism where basically the statues or objects are analyzed through anthropological or ethnographic lenses, right? And there they're managed, so the best pieces go to Europe, less good ones, according to the European eyes, stay in Africa, or worse, they are stored in museums, so you don't even see them, because what you see in museum is only 1% of the total amount of objects they have, etc., etc. Thank you, Suwon, for that idea of bringing heritage and AI together, because, well, I scratched my hair a bit and I lost a few on the way, but there are some parallels, right? Yes, this was about the euphemism we were talking about collecting, right? So there is this scholar Vastio who was curator at the Belgium Congo Museum, the Africa Museum, and he noticed in the archives, and this is why this is very difficult to find about colonialism in the archives, because they all use euphemism. So how can you detect whether these objects were stolen or not? The word they use is objects were collected, taken in, sheltered, gathered, made to reach Europe, etc., etc. And we know that they cut the hand of 10 million Congolese, right? So these are the kind of... before moving to like the AI thing, I wanted to show you those pictures, because these are from Congo memory boards. And what you are seeing here are not just objects, they are witness objects, museum objects. When I had this interview with the Africa Museum former director, Guido Grisels, he told me, oh yeah, but you know, Jeremy, 90% of the objects, they can substitute it, right? They still make spoons, so they can have a new spoon. They still have baskets, so they can substitute what we stole with their baskets, right? But when you steal this, you actually steal a whole museum. Because for the chief of that tribe, or the wise men, when they run their fingers on these memory boards, they have the whole history of their tribe written there. Their whole traditions, their whole, you know, knowledge is there. So once it's stolen, how do you do? How do you get it back? Well, maybe, I mean, we had big hopes with digitization. Maybe we should have big hopes with AI. Who knows? Maybe we can come up with something. So in Africa right now, as far as I know, we have 5 AI museums. And this is very interesting because the museum diplomacy, the museum cooperation landscape is shifting very fast. Out of those 5 museums, none of them are cooperating with Europe. Right? So supposedly we won't have that asymmetry, that old colonial pattern asymmetry. Or if we have a coloniality, then it might be clouded. And that's the concept I want to develop today. Maybe there is some sort of coloniality we don't see. It's a bit fuzzy, it's a bit clouded. So let me talk first about Ethiopia. Ethiopia has built an AI museum with China. So built and financed by China, but now run by Ethiopian. So it sounds pretty fair, but it's not very focused on artifacts or culture. It's more focused on how China can sell AI products in Africa, using Addis Ababa as a platform to launch its project on the African market. You have the Grand Egyptian Museum in Cairo, which is actually a cooperation between the JICA, the Japanese ODA cooperation agency, and Egypt. So okay, this is a North-South cooperation model, but not from Europe, from an Eastern donor, right? You have an AI museum about the prophets, about religion in Dakar. And this is co-financed by Saudi Arabia, because this is about rights, the Islam, right? And then you have the Moroccan and the South African museums, and those are 100% reliant on their own technologies. They don't depend on anyone, right? They build their own stuff. And that's why with Professor Kim Soo-won, we were attracted especially by the Moroccan museums, because they made their own algorithm and they don't rely on anybody, and they have this kind of, they say that their algorithm is called Kuyu, is an act of cultural resistance. You were talking before about resistance. It's an act of technological and cultural resistance. So we wanted to see how this works. I'll go very quickly because I think it's important to know what are the main AI functions, what you can do with AI in museums. So I checked what northern museums are doing and African museums are doing, and they're doing the same functions. So there's no lagging behind. So which means in theory that African museums are not dependent on northern or European technologies, right? And you have these different functions like managing collection, doing research, managing visitors, edutainment, education and entertainment put together, artistic creation, and what I call extensions. China, what China is doing in Ethiopia is a good example, using like it as a like diplomatic tool or commercial tool to sell your, like to promote your companies and sell your products on the African market. I remember one of the things David was saying, he was talking about cross-racial cooperation. That's exactly what he's doing, because Darknawa is not an ethnic group in Morocco, it's a spiritual community that is coming from former slaves from the 11th century on, slaves from African kingdoms that moved to Morocco, and it's common to different ethnic groups in Morocco. So it's a group that has been colonized twice, many times, maybe 3 times, by France and Spain first, from 1912 to 1956. And then after it has been not colonized, but marginalized by the central government. And now we have this young entrepreneur, this young curator, Usama, who's bringing his AI knowledge to try to decolonize his community. So in terms of what he's doing, he's collecting basically his data, what he said last time, we had a Zoom seminar with him. And 90% of his data is intangible. It's coming from ceremonies that are sung. I'm talking here about songs, basically. Those ceremonies can be for celebrating some events, or it can be healing ceremonies. They have some therapeutic functions as well. And then 10% is just manuscripts, right? So he's mixing this, and he's using a multi-language natural language processing tool, and he's using it in different languages. So it's interesting because it's multilingual. So because it's multilingual, then it's less colonial than before, when all the archives were just in French or in Spanish. And also, the second thing I wanted to say about this, he's focusing more exclusively on intangible cultural heritage, and the colonial bias was to focus almost exclusively on objects and material culture, beyond established patterns of museology. The research he's doing is basically he's taking all those ceremonies, talking to the masters of ceremonies, doing interviews or recording those ceremonies, and he's trying to pick the nuances of accents and pronunciation according to different regions within Morocco, but also outside of Morocco, because some of the Gnawa community spreads to sub-Saharan countries and also to Andalusia in Spain. So it's a very cross-national, cross-border project. It's not one country with one ethnic group and one type of tribe like the Europeans and the colonizer were doing. It's very cross-national, very fluid, very hybrid kind of categories, right? It's not doing much in terms of visitors management. That's why suddenly you see the Egyptian pyramid, which I'm also working on. But in terms of content management system, you can also have, I'm bringing this up because you can also have some decolonial tool. Instead of categorizing the museum goers through their nationalities, you can categorize them according not only to their ethnic group, but to the language they speak or to their connection to diaspora. So you have many equity parameters you can fit in those content management system, and Oussama in Morocco is not working on them at the moment. It's not the Moroccan museum we're working on is not big on edutainment. That's why, again, I'm giving you a sense of, we're talking today about youth empowerment, right? How you can attract the youth and converge STEM disciplines. So STEM is, right, science, technologies, engineering, and mathematics discipline within the museum to teach kids not fun stuff in a different way, in a more fun way through edutainment, gamification, virtual reality, screens, because kids love screens these days. So, going back to Morocco, don't worry. Artistic creation. So what Oussama is working on now is to have immersive performances so that visitors can see those performances through AR or VR, right? He's also building an interactive sound maps with the different places in Africa where the Gnawa community is exerting its ceremonies. And beyond 2030, the Gnawa plans to launch an AfriSound, basically a big platform, I will go back to it, where you can tokenize African songs so that the money goes back to the community at some point. Right. So I was even less than half satisfied with this first assessment and this first criteria, because it pretty much looks like, again, I'm going back to David, but David was saying that really interested me, that point. He was saying that after the apartheid movement, the students that registered in history majors fell, right? They didn't want to have anything to do with history and all. Right, and it's a bit the same with this museum, for instance, because actually there is no exhibitionary content, nothing about colonization. So the question I wanted to ask David, but I don't want to take the floor the whole afternoon, so I didn't ask it, is how can you get decolonization with historical amnesia, basically? Is it possible? And this is kind of what Oussama El-Asri is doing, because he's also very aware of colonization in a technological sense, but he's not making his museum goers aware in a very basic historical sense about the history of his community and where the goods of the Gnawa community are in Europe. So I decided to change criteria and go beyond the museum precincts, right? Because within the museum, coloniality is clouded. You don't really see it, or decoloniality or empowerment is clouded as well. You don't really see where this happens, right? So I want to see how the museum relates to the broader AI ecosystem, and I came up with 6 criteria. I will go briefly through them in as much as it deals with museum. I won't read everything, I won't go through everything because it's too detailed, but basically, even though Oussama and his museum, the Dagnawa Museum, are not talking about colonization directly, he made sure that the Dagnawa's museum data are stored locally. They're all stored in Moroccan data centers, and there are 12 of them. So he's not talking about decolonization, but in terms of data, he's very aware that the data shouldn't leave the country if he wants to be able to manage it, or at least to keep it sovereign, right? So that I thought that was very paradoxical, but very interesting, this kind of, on the one side being a bit blind and amnesic, and on the other side they're super aware about what shouldn't leave the country. The problem is, and I've seen it with the heritage laws, is that now Morocco is grafting its own AI laws from European models. And that happened in the heritage field, and we saw what happened. The UNESCO 1970 Convention about repatriating goods is basically anchoring the status quo. It's not, you cannot claim a good if your country signed, if the good was stolen before the convention was signed. So basically what it's saying is like, okay, we acknowledge it, but you cannot do anything about it. And that's what I'm afraid about Morocco copying the European model for its AI laws. That could be one of the problems. Of course, this is beyond the museum's scope, but this will impact museums, right? In terms of inclusivity, the Dagnawa Museum, I made that clear already, is very inclusive, which is great because it's collaborating with the Royal Institute of Amazigh Culture. So this is, Amazigh is the language they speak, and in 2011, they managed to put their own language in the Moroccan constitution, so that's very important. And in 2019, they managed to make this intangible Dagnawa intangible heritage as part of the UNESCO list. So here, in terms of inclusivity, the Dagnawa Museum is doing really well, and it's even, in my view, preempting legal initiatives in terms of access to data. So that's very good to have an AI-aware curator in this case. In terms of education, the Kuyo, so Kuyo is the algorithm they developed, has been used in schools because this algorithm, when it picks music, when it picks a song, it can write the music scores automatically, right? So it's been tested in schools, and this way people know about this algorithm, know about the museum, and it's kind of promotion for the museum, and they also want to apply for the 2030 World Cup. So this is how, he has this very broad vision, our curator in Morocco. This is how you can get a lifelong education beyond museums, right? In terms of innovation, I will go quickly on this one because there are many national programs, but the conclusion is the most important. There is nothing on culture, and there is a lack of initiative on digital anthropology and AI culture, philosophy of technology, etc. in Morocco. So that's one of their weaknesses. In terms of businesses, I was talking about it a bit earlier on. The benefits of investments in AI remain inaccessible to smaller institutions. That's one big concern. How much you should invest in AI before you can get return on investments, and it's not accessible for most people, for most companies, and even less for museums who desperately lack funds. So what Oussama again, and the Dagnawa Museum again, have been trying to do is rely on the diasporic communities, on the diaspora in North America, and I think it's called SMILians, S-M-I-Aliens. It's a Canadian, half Canadian, half American, US diasporic community, which has provided the machines, the knowledge in terms of AI, so that he could build his own algorithm for a very cheap budget, as he told us. So that was even accessible for small private institutions. So that's one way of avoiding big investments or depending on Mark Zuckerberg or whoever. Diplomacy, the last parameter. I think I've talked about it a lot already today, but basically the Gnawa community, Gnawa music is inscribed in the UNESCO list of intangible heritage. I talked about the Smilance with the diasporic community. Now what he's doing is he wants to cooperate with Senegal, with Mali, with Kenya, and with South Africa to mix together Zulu songs and Mali griot songs, and he has these whole ideas because one of the strengths of this technology he has is that it's transferable. It's kind of one size fits all. Once it picks a voice or an accent, you can directly reproduce it. Okay, cool. So that's about diplomacy. And he's also bringing the Gnawa community, who's also making handicrafts, to different festivals so that they can sell their stuff. So he's bringing them in festivals within Morocco and also to Dakar, to Senegal. So this is kind of the kind of project he has in terms of diplomatic terms. So I want to make 3 conclusions because I have 2 minutes left. So 1 minute for each, that will be 3 minutes. One on clouded coloniality. So that's what I was saying before, that coloniality or decoloniality are decorrelated from exhibition content. And that was very disturbing for me, who very narrow-mindedly works on museums and what's inside the museum. The decolonial process is actually taking place outside the museum, and this decolonial process is clouded to me not just because of the play on words. Okay, the data is clouded, right? But that means that it's often managed from abroad if you don't pay attention to where your data is stored, right? So that's disturbing. And also it's clouded because you don't have that historical knowledge necessarily about your community. Some Gen Z people don't want to hear about it, right? So it's not taking place where you expect it to happen. So, and it's taking place across different fields. That's why I call it a transversality of fields and actor. So it's hard to pinpoint it, it's hard to identify it, right? But Morocco has been able to come up with technocultural empowerment strategies. So it has its own algorithm, which it made with half with the diasporic community, but also with its own AI engineers and ethnographers, right? It's transferable, so it means it's not inclusive just for the Gnawa community, but it can be applied to other First Nations people. It's storing its data in certified national data centers, which means its data is not colonized yet. And then very often what happens is that the workshop they're doing are on a reverse tutelage basis, which means that the AI engineer is not imposing its own bias, but basically it's teaching in rotation with local holders of knowledge. So I thought that was an interesting point to include in this empowerment strategy. And then finally, that will be a bit of my talk next in a couple of weeks in Jeonju again, very dynamic African Studies Center in the head. Talking about GLAM. So what is GLAM? It's not just glamorous. It's galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, so that we can connect museums not just to the small museum field, but also to the colonial archives, to the data that are in libraries, and to the art galleries. Because if you ask the Gen Z, they don't really care about going to museum if they can't see live performances or if they can't see contemporary artists, right? So I think one of the drawbacks of Western museums is that they talk about old stuff a lot, but not what's going on on the African artistic stage, right? For donor countries like Korea, it might be useful to take a community-centric approach rather than taking a state-centric approach, because going through the state filters might not yield the same results. And what I've been noticing as well, I cannot elaborate on this right now, but there's a shift in the way ODA is perceived, even within policymakers in the ODA field. They are struggling and fighting to change the definition of ODA, and that might be interesting now that ODA is declining everywhere in the world, because they want to include as well private funds in this definition. And this matters because AI relies on private companies, right? So AI companies, tech companies might have a ever bigger role in helping techno-cultural empowerment or techno-cultural colonization again. And that will be my final word for today.